George H.W. Bush. Whether or not you loved him or you hated him, you can all agree that this man was certainly a memorable 41st president. Before his political career, in his childhood years, his family and upbringing influenced his values today. Let's go to our First Lady to see how exactly this happened.
I remember hearing about George a few years ago when he was young. Well, he was born into a wealthier family and accused for it by the public. My husband's family actually explicitly forbid any sort of apprentice behavior. By the time George had graduated from the Phillips Academy, he had become his class president and captain of his baseball and soccer team. George was the youngest pilot in the Navy by the time he joined, and he had delayed his acceptance into Yale to help us and our country fight in World War II against Japan.
Now, after his childhood, he got very interested in politics, and his rise to presidency was certainly memorable.
After earning millions of dollars from his oil company, Zapata Petroleum, George H.W. Bush decided to enter into politics. After a myriad of political losses and successes, Bush became director of the Central Intelligence Agency during the time of the Iran-Contra scandal, in which Reagan, and later Bush, were found to have sold weapons to Iran in exchange for the release of American hostages taken by Islamic militants. Becoming Reagan's vice president, he finally achieved the nomination for presidency and in 1988 finally won the election.
Part of Bush's campaign was the no new taxes implementation that we see him speaking of in his speeches.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
While this was certainly popular, domestic policy proved otherwise. A large starting federal debt of $2.8 trillion hampered Bush, and he wasn't able to fund many government projects. His actions revolved around his limited agenda, which stressed volunteerism, improvement of education, and anti-drug campaigns. Personal expert and friend Tiffany shows that George W. Bush also had some other great policies. She elaborates on what we previously explained.
During his acceptance speech, Bush said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." However, Bush and his economic policy ended up breaking his promise. In 1990, after a lot of compromise with the democratically controlled Congress, Bush signed the Omnibus Reconciliation Act. This aimed to reduce the deficit by cutting government spending and raising taxes. Republicans were outraged by the raise in taxes and saw Bush as a liar. Between 1990 and most of 1992, there was a recession, and Bush's approval rating dropped to 40%. Unemployment levels rose, and the public began to question America's ability to compete with other foreign nations.
Despite the huge unpopularity of Bush's tax claims, he implemented other policies that allowed the war on drugs to become one of his more popular domestic policies. Let's go back to Tiffany, expert and friend of George W. Bush.
Bush Sr. declared a war on drugs and created a program to fight what he called our country's gravest domestic threat. He increased law enforcement presence at borders, increased jail time for drug users, and instituted the death penalty for drug dealers.
The war on drugs was certainly a popular part of domestic policy. However, Bush was also widely known for his foreign policy.
Although George Bush Sr.'s foreign policy started off strong with the fixed relations between America and Soviet Union under Gorbachev, his choice in foreign policies like the disputed success of Operation Desert Storm, his refusal to use military force against Bosnian Serbs who were launching an ethnic cleanse of Bosnian Muslims, and his involvement in the Iran-Contra scandal severely dented his popularity.
As you can see, even popular newsletters like New York Times chided Bush for his actions in foreign policy. However, Bush was also famous for other operations implemented like Desert Storm. Let's go to Amy, foreign policy expert, to explain the issue.
On August 1st, 1990, when Saddam Hussein led the Iraqi army into Kuwait and took over oil fields, the UN responded with sanctions and warning to Hussein to pull back. However, when Hussein ignored UN sanctions, Bush and Gorbachev of Soviet Russia sent in 550,000 troops into Kuwait, with the support of billions of dollars from other nations. This marked the beginning of Operation Desert Storm. Hundreds of on-land soldiers, naval ships, and missiles hit the Iraq forces until finally, on February 27th, only about a month later, Bush proclaimed that the war was over. However, he also brought much criticism onto himself with these acts. He failed to pull Hussein from power and also was blamed for the Kuwait invasion in the first place because of sanctions he had placed on Iraq for the killing of Kurdish rebels.
Amy would also go on to further describe his Panama procedures, which became widely known as well in part of his foreign policy.
In 1989, when Panama's General Manuel Noriega rigged elections and declared a state of war within the UN, President George Bush Sr. sent in 24,000 troops to overthrow and capture him, resulting in the loss of 24 American lives and between 500 to 600 of Panamanian civilian casualties. The American troops managed to capture Noriega on charges of narcotics trafficking within a week. This feat brought a lot of good press to Bush and showed how he was really fighting for the end of drug trafficking.
The war on Panama combined both Bush's domestic policy as well as his foreign policy by tying in his concepts of drug trafficking and actually solving the war on drugs. Another foreign policy of Bush's was the Persian Gulf War.
The Persian Gulf War ended in February 1991 when Bush bombarded Iraq with missiles, fighter planes, and ground forces. He proclaimed a new world order where countries committed to moral leadership would contain aggressors and terrorists around the world.
Now, on to Dexter's opinion of Bush's implementations and policies.
So, Dexter, what are your views on George H.W. Bush, the 41st president? Uh-huh.